In this video, I will explain to you how the Mediterranean diet can help you. This diet has benefits for all people, but especially for people with diabetes, as I will explain in this video. I will also show research evidence for some of the key findings I talk about. The short name for the Mediterranean diet is simply Med Diet. So I will use that short name in the rest of this video. If you haven't heard of the Med Diet, I will first read a short excerpt from an excellent review of the Med Diet. So I'm quoting here. You can read the whole study for yourself if you like. The review is by Gaspare and Willett and was published in the Journal of Internal Medicine in 2021, and it is, to the best of my knowledge, open access. So, they say that the term Mediterranean diet was coined by Ancel Keys back in 1960. He was a researcher. It's one of the most studied and well-known dietary patterns worldwide. The origins of the traditional Med diet pattern are found in civilizations surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. The Med diet is most closely tied to traditional areas of olive cultivation in the Mediterranean region and has historically been associated with low rates of chronic diseases and high adult life expectancy. The same study also says the traditional Med diet is a plant-based diet and is characterized by high intakes of fruit and vegetables, nuts and seeds, legumes, pulses and grains, and of olive oil. It includes moderate amounts of fish, poultry, and fermented dairy products, yogurt and cheese, and low intakes of red and processed meat, sugar and sugary foods, and most refined or highly processed foods. So, the Med diet can be considered a primarily plant-based diet, but it is clearly not vegan or vegetarian. It's all about priorities for certain types of animal protein, such as fish instead of red meat. Now, the Med diet is not highly restrictive. Again, the focus is on what sort of foods should be the bulk of your diet and which foods should be eaten in moderation. And that's important, as there are so many very restrictive diets around, such as the keto diets, the low carb diets, the carnivore diets, or the vegan diet. The problem with such more restrictive diets is that most people find them very difficult to continue with. Of course, there are always people who will succeed, but if the majority of people cannot succeed, it shows, of course, that it is just really hard. And the argument with the Med diet is that it is because it's less restrictive, it's somewhat easier to follow. And that matters, because if you want a good diet for diabetes, you need something that is good for you and that you can more easily adhere to for a longer time. And the idea of the Med diet is that because you can continue it relatively easy, the benefits are greater. I must say though, of course, it all depends on people's personality and tastes and maybe even culture. So, people say this maybe, but, you will see that people who already follow the Mediterranean diet will, of course, say it's easy, but I suppose that if it's new to you, it might actually be quite difficult. So leave a comment below the video and say what your experience is, if you've maybe tried it. So that will be interesting. But clearly, it seems to me that a less restrictive diet is at least psychologically beneficial, and it's maybe more constructive. It's a more constructive way of approaching a diet. If a diet is becoming a daily struggle because it's so difficult, it's unlikely you can make it into a lifelong habit. But again, it varies from person to person. Now, let me give you an example of what a day on the MET diet could look like. Remember that the examples now that I'm going to give you are just examples. There are many different ways of doing this, and YouTube, for example, is a great resource of finding recipes and examples of what you could eat. And I must also say that there are probably slightly different interpretations of what a MET diet can look like. That's maybe partially because the Mediterranean Sea is a large area, and you have different cultures around the Mediterranean Sea that have slightly different diets. But there seem to be certain patterns that are consistently found in these countries. Now let's start with an example of a breakfast. For breakfast, for example, you can have oatmeal in which you mix some olive oil, some nuts and seeds, and maybe an apple cut in pieces. That way you have key ingredients of the MET diet, namely whole grains from the oats, nuts, seeds, fruits, and olive oil. Know that oats is proven to lower cholesterol, and that's always a good thing. Another note here is that, to the best of my understanding, is that milk is not really a key component of the MET diet. But instead of milk, you can make oatmeal really well, for example, with something called almond milk or soy milk. You can just soak the oats overnight in the almond milk or in the soy milk, and you will see that this preparation method is actually much easier and saves you the time of cooking the oatmeal in the morning. Just by soaking, the oats become soft. It just takes more time, but if you do that overnight, it's really handy. That's what I do, and I love it. I find it really easy. Now let's go to an example of lunch. Now, let's say you bring food to work. For this, you can have a few slices of maybe whole grain bread with, for example, hummus. Personally, I find that a nice combination, and hummus is made from chickpeas, which is a legume, which is healthy proteins, which are key in the MET diet. Again, with that, you could probably have an easy peeler for fruit, like a small satsuma. Also nice is to, like in the example, cut a tomato into slices and add it to the bread. And with the bread, you can have maybe some delicious mozzarella cheese, like in this picture. And cheese and yogurt are parts of the MET diet. Now let's go to an example for dinner. Let's say you can have a nice meal consisting of beans with spices. Any type of bean will do. You can eat a piece of fish with it, like here in the picture, right? It really looks great. Maybe you can add a small salad with some added bell pepper, cucumber, mini tomatoes, radishes, maybe some sunflower seeds, and some, of course, olive oil. Now, let's, by the way, so these three meals that I've shown, I mean, it's sort of like a random selection from things that actually I like to eat. I did not add any sugary desserts like the one on the picture here. Such desserts are in principle allowed in the MET diet, but arguably, if you have diabetes, you might benefit from skipping them. For people with diabetes, there are different approaches to eating sweets, and that's not part of this video. It is sort of like a different topic. Now that you have seen a bit of an idea of what the MET diet is and what it can look like, I want to start looking at some of the evidence for why this diet is a good diet for people with and for people without diabetes. Before we go to diabetes, let's quickly address why this diet is generally good for all people. one of the main original findings in the 1960s was that Mediterranean farmers had far less heart disease, and today it is generally believed that the Med diet is good for your cardiovascular system, that is your heart and your blood vessels. One reason why that might be the case might be related to cholesterol, because the Med diet seems to have a cholesterol lowering effect. But then I have read research that says that that is not the whole story. In fact, with the Med diet, there are multiple reasons for why the different key components of the diet work well, and they all work together. And you could argue so that the whole of the Mediterranean diet is more than the sum of the parts. Yeah, so you could argue each of these key components on their own, they can be healthy, as we shall also later see in regard to the benefits of olive oil in the diet of people with type 1 diabetes. But there is an argument that I've seen made where people say bringing all these things together is what is really the benefit of the Mediterranean diet. And we come back to that. Anyway, so the lowering of cholesterol is good news for people with diabetes, given that people with diabetes should look after their cholesterol and after their cardiovascular health. Now, for example, you as you probably know, statins are often prescribed to people with diabetes, at least in the United Kingdom. And the Med diet can help also, can help with lowering cholesterol. So that's a great benefit. The next thing I'd really like to talk about is that the Med diet is not just good for your body, but also for your mind. And I'm really impressed with that. Now, of course, I'm a professor of psychology, and I find that fascinating. The Med diet is clearly associated with lower levels of depression, as was shown, for example, in a randomly controlled study with young men, and it was published in 2022. And I'll show you the paper here that I'm talking about. So the study is called "The Effect of a Mediterranean Diet on the Symptoms of Depression in Young Males." A randomized controlled trial. And randomized controlled trials mean that participants are assigned to different conditions of the experiment at random. So this was a 3-month study in which participants either were following the Med diet or had talking sessions in which they talked about interesting neutral topics with someone about things such as movies, sports, or hobbies. Now, interestingly, the group of young men, that the group that was on the Med diet did better in terms of depression scores. And I found that, actually, when I read the paper, I found that quite impressive. I found it really interesting because if you think about it, you could say, well, it's just food, but it clearly seems to work. Now, it is important in general, of course, but also given that depression is more common in people with diabetes than in the sort of like in the rest of the population. One study from 2018 wrote that, and I'll show the study here on the screen. The study is called "Depression in People with Type 2 Diabetes, Current Perspective." So they wrote, the likelihood of depression in type 2 diabetes mellitus is approximately double that found in the general population. Now, double. And we know that, so from other research, that in people with type 1 diabetes, depression is common too. There is also evidence that depression in people with type 1 diabetes is underdiagnosed and undertreated. So the benefits of the MET diet on depression in type 2 diabetes is quite convincing. When it comes to direct evidence for the benefits of the MET diet for people with diabetes, it seems though that there is more research about type 2 than type 1 diabetes. But there is clearly evidence for benefits on type 1 diabetes as well, as I will show later. But first let's see more of the research showing that the benefits of the MET diet for type 2 diabetes. There is a fascinating, the right slide here, so that is actually the summary that I wanted to show you. This is the paper that reviews everything. And the main conclusion from this paper is that the MET diet has clear benefits for people with type 2 diabetes, and that it helps potentially to prevent type 2 diabetes. One specific benefit that they talk about is a reduction on HbA1c values, and other benefits compared to other diets were things such as lower cholesterol and weight reduction. There are also specific benefits reported for people with type 1 diabetes. A 2016 randomly controlled study published in Diabetes Care showed that extra virgin oil, as you see here behind me, reduced glucose spikes following meals. And the paper that was published is this, and you can find this in the journal Diabetes Care. The bottom line is that that the olive oil with meals reduces glucose spikes following the meals. And it makes sense to link this to the Mediterranean diet because olive oil is such a key component of the MET diet. The interesting thing, I think, is also is that it was a randomized control study, and they didn't find this reduced effect, for example, when they had low-fat meals or meals with butter instead of olive oil. So it's not just having any fat, but olive oil seems to have something specific. That's interesting. How exactly they had the quantities compared and so on is a little bit too much detail for here. But the point that I wanted to make is that there is something about the Mediterranean diet, including taking olive oil, that benefits not just people with type 2 diabetes, but also type 1 diabetes. To this latter study, I would like to add something though. It seems to me that there is much more on the MET diet than olive oil alone. So in that sense, the study is maybe somewhat limited. Because if you're doing the MET diet, it's also about consumption of nuts, vegetables, fruits, and fish. And what's lacking from the research, I think, is a randomly controlled study with type 1 that might show some sort of like a benefit on self-management or on blood glucose values. Apart from this study, of course. So the limited evidence of the Mediterranean diet in type 1 diabetes has been commented on. So I should show that. So there is a study that says there is insufficient high-quality evidence for the role of the MET diet in the prevention and management of type 1 diabetes and the management of gestational diabetes. Overall, though, I would say it's clear that there is specific evidence for the benefits of the MET diet over other diets, even though the evidence for type 1 is extremely limited. So you really need to think of this Diabetes Care study, and there is of course more. But then you could argue, of course, there are generic benefits related to depression and cholesterol lowering effects of this diet, and I suppose that just has not been studied. So therefore we don't know it. So if you think about it, for example, what about researchers doing a study on the MET diet in people with type 1 diabetes and then check if people with type 1 diabetes, for example, report lower levels of depression? I mean, that would be a potential, research design that you could do, and it would actually be quite interesting. So maybe somebody's going to do that. I'd like to go to a conclusion now. And so the first conclusion that I'd like to make is generally that the MET diet is healthy. So whether you have diabetes or not. And by the way, before you switch to the MET diet, don't do that just because I said so. Always first talk to your medical team. I think that is, that is sort of like key advice. Whenever you're going to make big changes, like say, oh, I want to change my diet, make sure that you discuss it with your medical team. Important advice, right? So this, I'm not here giving advice on what you should do, but actually what I do in this video is telling you what I've read in literature, and it's interesting stuff. And once you've heard about it, you might say, oh, I'm going to explore that. I'm going to talk to my doctor and I'm going to read more about it and so on. But generally speaking, the MET diet is healthy for all people. The second conclusion is some of the important health issues that are related to diabetes, such as problems with cardiovascular health, high cholesterol, and depression, those issues, they seem to benefit actually from a MET diet. In the general population, typically, that's studied, and partially, of course, in people with type 2 diabetes especially, but I think it's the research is quite impressive, I would say, and certainly it makes it worth considering as a diet. And the third point, I would also say, and this is somewhat disappointing, there is insufficient evidence to say that the MET diet improves the actual management of type 1 diabetes. And that is in part, I would conclude, due to a lack of research on this topic. So, now, my question to you is, what do you actually think? Have you ever considered the MET diet? Discuss it with your doctor if you think these things sound interesting. Now, if you're still watching at this point, it seems to be the case that you liked my video. Please like and subscribe, because that really helps a beginning channel like this one. And this way, you will hear about similar content and more similar videos in the future. Thank you for watching, and see you soon again.